hand squeezed Peter Tunstall's shoulder, pressing him down into the tangled undergrowth of an Essex wood. He was 13 years old, lying flat beside his father, Joseph Tunstall, a former soldier turned headmaster who had brought him here to poach. The lesson was simple: lie still, control your breathing, and cease to exist. A gamekeeper and his black Labrador passed within spitting distance, their scent carried away by a shift in the wind. It was a close call, and the boy learned that patience and stillness could mean the difference between discovery and survival. That lesson from his boyhood would echo across 13 years, resurfacing in a pine wood on the Baltic coast during a war that was still unthinkable. For now, Peter Tunstall was just a scrappy village boy with a passion for airplanes and a deep longing to escape the dreary routine of school. His father, scarred by the Boer War and the trenches, wanted him to be a scholar, but the boy had other plans. He had already felt the slipstream in a joyride over Orsett, and there was no turning back. Tunstall scraped together the money for flying lessons by shooting rabbits at dawn and selling the meat to local housewives. 16 rabbits bought an hour of dual instruction in a rattling old Cirrus Moth, registration GEBTG, a faithful machine with a fabric skin and a wooden propeller. His instructor, a bearded vagabond named Dixie Gerrans, ran a tumble-down flying club out of a hayfield near West Horndon. In April 1937, after a final check with a one-legged examiner named Paddy Flynn, Tunstall took the Moth up alone and sang into the wind. I'm solo, I'm bloody well solo. With his civilian pilot's license in hand, he applied for a short service commission in the Royal Air Force. The recruiting officer at Chelmsford tested him with a strange interview trick. He tossed a toffee across the room and told him to catch it. Tunstall snatched it cleanly, and the officer smiled. He passed. But his father was still reluctant, and the boy had to strike a bargain. If he applied himself at school and passed matriculation, he could keep flying. He kept his word, and so did his father. The RAF was now within reach. On a warm July afternoon in 1937, Tunstall committed the young pilot's classic sin. He borrowed the Cirrus Moth, flew low over the swimming pool at a country club called The Chase, and put on an aerobatic display for the startled guests. He pulled up steeply, stall turned, and circled so low that witnesses later said they could identify him in court. They wrote down the registration letters that evening. His father's wrath was something to behold, and worse followed. A police officer arrived at the front door with a fat black notebook and a formal caution. Tunstall's dream of an RAF career seemed to crumble. His father threatened to withdraw his support. But Joseph Tunstall, himself a justice of the peace, went to see the chief constable of Essex and argued for leniency. The letter of the law was upheld with a formal caution, but the young pilot's record was not destroyed. He learned something important that day. Even when you have made a serious mistake, there are men who will step forward and give you a second chance. He never forgot it. In the spring of 1938, Tunstall reported for ab initio training at the civilian flying school at Hamble. He was eager, studious, and scoring top marks, but he soon attracted the wrong kind of attention. His course commander, an older former Army officer with aristocratic connections, began to target him with petty disciplinary niggles. It escalated into a slow, grinding vendetta that left Tunstall isolated and fearful. He confided in his flying instructor, Pilot Officer John Marshall, who listened to the whole miserable story and promised to handle it in his own way. Marshall was suddenly posted away, and the vendetta came to a head. Tunstall was suspended from duties pending termination of his commission. He went home in despair, but his father, after reading the full report, took him to see the Lord Lieutenant of Essex, Sir Francis Whitmore. The old colonel asked sharp questions and promised to look into why the course commander had left a fine army regiment. A month later, a letter arrived ordering Tunstall to report to No. 3 Flying Training School at South Cerney. His record was wiped clean, and there, waiting for him with a grin, was John Marshall, promoted to flying officer. The nightmare was over. Tunstall was posted to 49 Squadron at RAF Scampton in the summer of 1938, flying Hawker Hinds, the last of the open cockpit biplane bombers. The squadron was transitioning to the new Handley Page Hampton, a twin-engine monoplane with retractable gear and a fighter-style cockpit. But there was no conversion course. The senior pilots simply read the notes and flew the thing. The juniors were left on the ground for months, growing rusty and frustrated. Tunstall felt his dream of being an active pilot slipping away. In the midst of this stagnation, he found an unlikely mentor in Corporal John Keating, an old wireless operator and air gunner with a row of First World War medal ribbons and a fatherly demeanor. Keating saw the young officer's unhappiness and said simply, "You love the service, don't you, sir? Then why don't you bung in another application for a commission?" Tunstall did, and it was granted. But on the 23rd of November 1939, Keating was killed when a Hampton crashed into a hangar at Scampton. The old soldier who could not be frightened by a spin in the air was gone, and Tunstall had lost one of the men who had shaped him. In September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. For Pilot Officer Peter Tunstall, still grounded at Scampton while senior pilots hoarded the Hampton flying time, the outbreak of war changed nothing at first. He flew no operational sorties. He sat in the mess, frustrated, watching others take the war to the enemy while his own logbook gathered dust. In early 1940, he was posted to 61 Squadron at RAF Hemswell, but the lack of hands-on flying continued to frustrate him. The inadequacy of his training would soon become a deadly liability. By mid-1940, Tunstall finally had a crew and a role as navigator and bomb aimer under Pilot Officer Alec Webster. On their first operation together, they bombed an oil refinery near Hanover on the return flight. Thick fog swallowed the English coast. Fuel ran low. Webster ordered the crew to prepare for a crash landing, then spotted a small break in the cloud and put the Hampton down hard in a field. They walked away. The aircraft was a write-off. 2 nights later, they were over Reims. Searchlights coned them. Light flak poured upward. Webster pulled into a stall, turned to shake the dazzle, lost orientation, and the Hampton flipped onto its back. Tunstall and every loose object in the nose slammed against the roof. Webster, halfway out of the cockpit to bail out, was pinned by his own sliding hood as the aircraft completed an uncontrolled loop. By some miracle, he fell back into his seat, grabbed the controls, and leveled out just above the rooftops. They bombed the target and flew home. Tunstall's ankle was badly sprained. For weeks afterward, he woke from nightmares of that inverted fall. On that same REMS mission, another problem emerged in the chaos. The Elsen chemical toilet, an absurd feature of the Hampton's cramped fuselage, had cracked during the violent maneuvers. Its pungent disinfectant, Elsenol, soaked Tunstall's maps and navigation equipment. He initially mistook the dark fluid for blood or hydraulic fluid. The crew landed back at Hemswell reeking of the stuff, and the joke spread across the station. But Tunstall did not laugh. His confidence in himself and his equipment was eroding. July 1940 brought a different kind of disaster. Returning from a raid on Benrath, a navigational error sent Tunstall's crew into the London balloon barrage at dawn. Barrage balloons, fat and shadowy, slid past on all sides, each tethered to an invisible steel cable. The crew shouted frantic course corrections from the nose. Tunstall climbed hard and weaved. Somehow clearing the cables, they landed at RAF Kenley, a fighter station south of London, low on fuel and shaking. A check of the radio revealed the problem. Sergeant Brock, the wireless operator, had misread his Morse bearings, steering them toward London instead of Lincolnshire. The squadron commander, Wally Sheen, did not care about explanations. He had just returned from an abortive chase of the German battleship Deutschland, a debacle that cost aircraft to both enemy fire and friendly Spitfires. Sheen needed someone to absorb his frustration, and Tunstall was the target. The harangue was blistering. Tunstall walked out of the office, feeling that he had failed his crew, failed the squadron, and failed himself. The lack of proper training, the unreliable radios, the impossible navigation, none of it mattered to Sheen. Only results counted. Tunstall's crew redeemed themselves on the night of August 10, 1940. Briefed to bomb the oil refinery at Salzburgen, they became lost in thick cloud. Unable to find the target, Tunstall turned for home in frustration. Then Sergeant Murdoch, the navigator, spotted an aircraft below with its navigation lights switched on. It was a German bomber, lit like a Christmas tree, preparing to land. Tunstall made a decision. He would follow the German down and bomb whatever airfield it was using. The German aircraft flashed a Morse identification light. Tunstall waited. then flipped on his own lights and flashed the same letters. Below, the airfield lights blazed on. The Hampton made a normal approach, lined up with the hangars, and Murdoch shouted, "Bombs gone!" As the Hampton banked away, the bombs struck. Secondary explosions ripped through the German base. The crew watched flames and smoke billow upward, cheering through the intercom. It was the most satisfying moment of Tunstall's operational career. There was no praise from Wally Sheen the next morning. Tunstall reported the attack but could not identify the airfield precisely. The squadron records later listed the target as Lastrup, though no one could confirm it. What mattered to Tunstall was that for one night, his crew had fought back effectively. They had outsmarted the enemy, they had done real damage. The taste of success was rare and it did not last long. On August 26, 1940, Tunstall and his crew took off for Leipzig. Their target was the Luna synthetic oil plant at Merseburg, the deepest penetration raid they had ever attempted. The weather forecast warned of fronts and cloud. The round trip would take at least 8 hours. Tunstall was determined not to abort. He had resolved never to turn back again. 9 hours into the flight, the situation was desperate. Thick cloud had obscured the ground for the entire crossing. The radio generator had failed, and the battery was flat. The fuel gauges flickered near zero. Tunstall's backside, after sitting on a rock-hard parachute pack for nearly a full shift, was numb with pain. The crew saw a coastline in the gray dawn light, but could not tell if it was England, Holland, or something else. They had been blown far off course by winds they never knew existed. Tunstall made the call. He reversed course toward the east, gambling that they would hit land somewhere. The starboard engine coughed and died as a coastline appeared below. He put the Hampton down on a long stretch of firm, wet sand, wheels down, both engines silent. The aircraft was intact. They were on the island of Vlieland in the Dutch Frisian chain. German soldiers emerged from the dunes with machine guns. Tunstall fired a red flare to signal the others to burn the confidential documents, but there was barely enough fuel left to light a match. They were prisoners. The Germans marched them to the mainland. At the frontier, the escort announced with pride, "We are now in Germany." Tunstall felt a cold finality. Until that moment, they had been among people who might help them. Now every hand was turned against them. He remembered a lecture from squadron leader A.J. Evans, the First World War escaper who had visited Hemswell earlier that summer. Evans had told them, "Your first duty is to escape. Your second is to be as big a bloody nuisance as possible." Tunstall committed those words to memory. At Stalag Luft, the Luftwaffe's reception camp near Frankfurt, Tunstall was placed in solitary confinement. The interrogators tried every trick. A friendly Swiss gentleman from the Red Cross who wanted to know his squadron, a blustering officer who threatened him with a firing squad. Tunstall stuck to name, rank, and number. After a week, he was moved to the main compound. There he encountered a strange atmosphere. The permanent British staff seemed comfortable, almost cooperative. They warned the new arrivals not to attempt escape. Tunstall was disgusted. He did not yet know that the senior officer, Wing Commander H.E. Prickyday, was running a secret escape organization and needed to protect it from impulsive newcomers. Soon enough, Tunstall was packed into a train with other new prisoners and sent to Stalag Luft 1 at Barth on the Baltic coast. The journey took 48 hours. 3 officers jumped from the train in the darkness. At Barth, the reception was deliberately theatrical. Searchlights, snarling dogs, a burst of machine gun fire over their heads. The camp security officer, Major von Stachelski, a small martinet with a screaming voice, told them escape was impossible. Tunstall stood in the floodlit compound, hungry and cold, and thought about the German airfield he had seen through the wire. He began to plan. In the autumn of 1940, the dreary routine at Stalag Luft 1 was shattered by a discovery. The senior British officer, squadron leader Brian Padden, had long suspected the Germans were listening. A careful search found microphones hidden above the ceilings, tucked near the holes cut for stovepipes. Padden did not simply remove them. He connected the microphone wires to the camp's main electrical supply. The German listening equipment in the Kommandantur blew up with a puff of smoke. Within the hour, a German riot squad charged into the prisoners' compound. They carried rifles and bayonets and wore heavy boots. The prisoners cheered as the guards split up and stormed into the barrack blocks. Ladders went up to the ceiling trapdoors, and German soldiers climbed into the roof space. Padden had anticipated this. He had ordered several key rafters to be nearly sawn through. The timbers gave way. Germans crashed through the ceilings and landed on the floor below to roars of laughter from the prisoners. There was no serious violence, but the message was clear. The prisoners would not be passive. For Peter Tunstall, still brooding on the words of the escaped lecturer back at Hemswell. The incident sharpened his resolve. Tunstall took that instruction to heart, and the microphone riot was only the beginning of his campaign to be a constant nuisance. Tunstall had been studying the camp's routines for weeks. The daily football party marched out each afternoon under parole. The Germans checked the count when the party returned, but they checked too late. They let the men into the compound first, then counted. Tunstall saw the flaw. He joined the party as a spectator, wrapped in a blanket, and did not sign the parole book. Near him, inside the wire, a staged fistfight broke out as a diversion. Tunstall positioned himself on the left of the column, directly behind a German guard. He began singing "Pack Up Your Troubles in Your Old Kit Bag." The others joined in, making a raucous noise. At the signal, Tunstall threw off his blanket to a comrade and clapped a German field service cap onto his head. The black working jacket with Unteroffizier stripes was already under the blanket. He stepped out of the column, turned about, and walked back past the guards as one of their own. He moved between the German huts, carrying a small sack. A group of off-duty guards stared at him, but he pretended to feed rabbits in hutches near the wire. When their attention drifted, he tossed his sack over the perimeter fence and climbed after it. He dropped into the snow and limped into a finger of pine woods that pointed toward the camp. His sprained ankle, injured over Rems months earlier, throbbed with every step. He changed into a Swedish seaman's disguise, buried the German boots and cap under pine needles, and set off through the frozen countryside toward the Baltic coast. He walked through the bitter cold, hiding in a frozen beet pile at a dairy farm, then jumped onto a milk truck heading for the nearest town. The truck turned back toward Barth instead of Stralsund. Tunstall jumped off at a corner and caught a tram into Stralsund with no money and no papers. A policeman stopped him in the town square. Tunstall claimed to be a Swedish seaman who had been robbed, but the police were not convinced. When news of his escape arrived from the camp, they locked him in the town jail. At the jail, Tunstall tried to cut his hand on a tin mug to get into the exercise yard, hoping to climb the wall. He smeared blood on his palm and called for water. The old jailer let him out. Tunstall threw his jacket over the barbed wire and began hauling himself up. Guards from Stalag Luft 1 arrived at that moment. They pulled him down and dragged him back to camp. Major von Stachelski, the security officer, raged and threatened to have him shot for wearing German uniform. The threat was not carried out, but Tunstall spent 15 days in solitary confinement. After his release from the cells, Tunstall's reputation as a troublemaker was sealed. He was transferred first to Offlag 9A at Spangenberg Castle, then to a camp at Thorn. At each stop, he planned new escapes. All of them failed. The Germans, losing patience, placed him on the Deutschfeindlich list. Prisoners on that list were considered irredeemably anti-German. Rumors said they would be executed if Germany began to lose the war. Tunstall continued his attempts regardless, piling up hundreds of days in solitary confinement. He was becoming one of the most determined escapers the British had ever produced. From Thorn, he was transferred to Colditz Castle in June 1942. In June of 1942, a train arrived at the small station of Colditz, a picturesque Saxon town on the Mulde River. Peter Tunstall was among a group of prisoners who were marched off the train and toward the massive stone castle that loomed above them on a steep hill. The castle had been a royal residence, a hunting lodge, and a mental asylum, but in wartime Germany it had become something else entirely, a maximum security prison for the worst escape risks in the German prison system. Tunstall had been transferred there because the Germans had finally run out of patience with him. As the prisoners crossed the bridge and approached the main gate of Colditz Castle, they heard an extraordinary noise. Cheering, whistling, and shouts of encouragement poured down from the barred windows high above. Shreds of cloth and scraps of paper were waved from the openings like makeshift flags. The racket grew louder as they entered the cobbled courtyard, where German officers had set up 2 tables to process the new arrivals. Then the water bombs began to fall, splattering across the desks and soaking the paperwork. A burning palliasse was thrown from an upper window and crashed onto the stones below. For a moment, the German officers stared upward in disbelief. Then a riot squad doubled in, wearing steel helmets and carrying rifles. The guards pointed their weapons at the windows, and the prisoners above quietened only slightly. Tunstall watched the whole performance with a sense of grim satisfaction. This was not Spangenberg, where the prisoners had been subdued and cooperative. This was a different kind of camp entirely. The inmates of Colditz were men who had been sent here precisely because they would not stop fighting, and they had no intention of starting now. Once the processing was complete and the Germans withdrew, the Colditz inmates poured into the courtyard to welcome the newcomers. A smiling officer with glasses introduced himself as Jack Keats and invited Tunstall to join his mess in the Belgian quarters. Tunstall was taken up a spiral staircase to a top-floor room lined with double-tier bunks, wooden tables, and chairs made from Red Cross crates. There he met fellow prisoners who would become his comrades in the elaborate escape organization that operated within the castle walls. Among them was John Mansell, a master forger whose skills would prove essential to every serious escape plan. At Colditz, the escape organization was not a casual hobby, but a disciplined, full-time operation. Every prisoner who arrived was assessed for his potential contribution. Tailors made civilian clothing, engineers studied the castle's weaknesses, and forgers like John Mansell produced flawless identity papers. Tunstall threw himself into this work, helping to plan tunnels and breakouts while watching for any opportunity to slip away himself. The Germans responded by increasing their security, and Tunstall found himself spending more and more time in the solitary confinement cells that had been built into the castle's basement. He did not care. Each failed attempt only sharpened his determination to try again. In the spring of 1944, news reached Colditz that confirmed every prisoner's darkest fear. 50 recaptured British officers from the Great Escape at Stalag Luft 3 had been shot on direct orders from Berlin. The Gestapo had murdered them in cold blood, one by one, in a field along a country road. The message was unmistakable. The Germans were no longer willing to treat escape as a legitimate act of war. Tunstall had already been warned that his name was on the Deutsche Feindlich list, a secret roster of prisoners who would be liquidated if Germany began to collapse. He continued planning anyway. There was no other choice. Once at Colditz, the solitary confinement continued to accumulate until it reached a total never surpassed by any British prisoner of war, 415 days. He had been locked in dark, freezing cells with nothing but a blanket and a bucket, fed bread and water, and left alone with his thoughts for weeks and months on end. Some men broke under such treatment. Tunstall emerged from each spell more stubborn than before. In April of 1945, the war in Europe was grinding to its end. American tanks of the 273rd Infantry Regiment approached Colditz, and the German guards began to melt away. On April 16th, a jeep rolled through the main gate, carrying a grinning American soldier who shouted up at the barred windows, "You're free!" The castle erupted in chaos as prisoners stormed the courtyards, tore down the fences, and embraced one another in disbelief. After nearly 5 years of captivity, Tunstall walked out of Colditz Castle a free man. He did not linger in Germany. He made his way to the coast, crossed the Channel, and traveled north toward Orsett, where his family had waited for years without knowing whether he was alive or dead. He found Anne, the girl he had left behind in the summer of 1940, the one whose picture he had carried in his breast pocket during every mission and every escape. The war was over. The work of rebuilding his life was about to begin. In the summer of 1945, Tunstall returned to Orsett and married Anne. The ceremony was quiet, a private commitment after nearly 5 years of separation. He kept the receipt from the Imperial Hotel in Llandudno, a souvenir of their last dance before the war, tucked inside his pocket as he had on the Hampton. He remained in the Royal Air Force, serving until 1958, his flying career cut short not by the enemy but by the accumulated weight of captivity. Of the men who had shaped his war, Brian Padden was transferred to Colditz and remained a formidable escaper until liberation. After retirement from the service, he moved to South Africa, where the climate suited his health and the distance offered perspective. Decades later, in 2014, he published The Last Escaper, not as a boast of adventure, but as a final report. The book stripped away the jolly good lark cliches and presented the raw truth: hunger, loneliness, the constant fear of execution, and the grim arithmetic of Bomber Command, where 51 out of every 100 men died. Tunstall's story was never about triumph over the Germans. It was about a stubborn refusal to submit to the enemy, to boredom, to despair. He held to the instruction given by squadron leader Evans to be as big a bloody nuisance as possible, and in the end, that nuisance, recorded in 415 days of solitary confinement and 7 escape attempts, became his quiet legacy. The last of the Colditz generation, he spoke not of glory but of duty. If you have family memories from this era, stories of service, captivity, or the home front, we would welcome hearing them in the comments. We read everyone. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like to support more historical documentaries. Thank you sincerely for listening.